Hi, my name is Alex, and in this episode of Magic Missile Minis, I'm going to be sculpting another one of my commissions, and in this video we're going to be sculpting a ghost. So, to start out with, I cut out a long piece of wire and fold it in half, crimping it down with some pliers and then using those same pliers to twist out a torso. What I would normally use for the legs, I'm going to use for two different things. One is going to be how I'm going to attach it to the base, and the other is going to be one of the supports for the billowing dress that she's going to have. I also make sure, of course, to give her arms and then bend those into the position that I want her to be in. Once I have the pose sorted and where I want it to be, I start adding some green stuff to the miniature. Adding a little bit onto the bottom where it's attached to the cork bottle so that the miniature doesn't spin as I'm sculpting on it. As I mentioned, I was going to have the ghost have a billowing dress. So I add a little bit of green stuff and then add a bunch of wires into that green stuff, and those are going to act as the many supports for the dress itself. So I go ahead and add maybe 3 or 4 of these and let that green stuff set so that I can add more green stuff on later. And while I wait, I start sculpting the face for this miniature, sculpting out the basic shape for the face. After that, I can return to the miniature itself and start adding a thin layer of green stuff over all of the wires that we had just added. This process can be a little bit finicky, so generally I try to get it on there with my fingers and then manipulate it as much as I can with some rubber sculpting tools, as well as using some of my metal tools. Doing this around the entirety of the miniature, trying to get one nice seamless cloak. I then can return to the face and start drilling in some little holes for the eyes that I'm going to add, doing that with a sharp craft knife. For the actual details on the face, I wanted the figure to look ghostly and kind of creepy, so I almost make it look a little bit like a zombie face that I'm going to paint in a way that makes it look more ghostly. And here you can kind of see what I'm going for with it, just kind of like ghostly, haunting face as I'm adding some of the other details like the mouth and nose to it. I then add a big lump of leftover green stuff to create something that looks a little bit like a rock, and that's how I'm going to hide the fact that the figure is a little bit off of the base, and of course make it look like the figure is floating. I then can add more green stuff onto the dress that we've been sculpting. And now I can start defining the actual folds that are going to be in the clothing. This is one of the things where it's really important to have some kind of reference so that you know exactly how the clothing should be folding. The more you do it, the less reference you should need, but for something like this, which is very complicated, intricate, and very billowy, you're always going to want some reference of some kind. So anybody who is trying to get better at sculpting cloaks, I would highly advise sculpting a ghost or something like this. Because of course it's a lot of clothing, a lot of material folding in different ways, but it's also just a really useful miniature to have. Which is always nice to have a type of miniature you can be sculpting that will be very useful for any D&D campaigns that you're playing, but also gives you great practice in sculpting certain things that are very important to understand how to sculpt. But anyways, once I have the main fold of the cloth where I like them, I add a little bit of green stuff onto the very ends of the clothing to make it look ripped and torn. And once that's where I like it, I can start working on the rest of her dress. I decided I would have part of the dress going over one shoulder and the other to kind of be torn off and a little bit smaller and ripped. Here you can see me sculpting in again some of the folds that are going to be in the shoulder and where the material is being stretched. And here you can see me adding a little bit more green stuff for the kind of torn shoulder of the dress that I had mentioned trying to sculpt before. I can now go back to the face that is done setting and take that off of what I was working on it on and add a little bit of green stuff onto that so that I can attach it to the miniature itself. I was planning on the figure having some long billowing hair as well to kind of match the billowing ghostly feel of the entire miniature. So I add some wires into the green stuff on her head that I can use as an armature for her hair. I then can start working on this seemingly corset belt thing that the miniature has around her waist. So as I mentioned before, I had added wires into the figure's head for armature for the hair. Unfortunately, once the green stuff had dried, wires just kind of fell out. I decided to do something else instead. I realized since I wanted the hair to have a lot of volume, I would just add big bits of green stuff that basically for a good little while turning this character into a ghost that wanted to dress up as Sonic for Halloween this year, apparently. But anyways, once that was finished, I decided to add the texture for the hair. I also apparently decided to do all of that off camera, so you can't exactly see what's going on. But either way, I basically just added little noodles of green stuff that I had curled at the very end, and then spread those around the 3 large blobs that I had added to create the hair texture. And here you can see how that turned out. But once that detail was added, the miniature was finished. Here you can see it with a prime of Citadel Colors Mechanicus Standard Gray rather than the Chaos Black. Since I wanted the miniature to be white, I wanted to use a lighter prime. You can kind of see here as I add the white paint, I have to add several layers of the paint for it to actually get a full coverage, even with the slightly lighter color as a prime. So after adding about 3 or 4 coats of this base white, I can move on to paint the rest of the details. The way I was planning on painting this miniature was having every part that was far away from the center of the miniature to be slowly getting more and more blue, rather than white. Paint you just saw me using was a little bit of black added to this model color Vallejo Azure. But in the end, I thought it was too gray, and so I just added this light blue over top of everything, adding it around the end of the dress as well as her hands and the ends of her hair. And once that's done, I can start adding more of the blue and the white and start creating a gradient going up from there. The technique I'm using here is just wet blending, so adding some of the azure paint and then taking some white while both of them are still wet and blending them together over the entire miniature, which is just a really convenient way to create a large gradient that's going over such a large surface. Here you can kind of see how the miniature is coming along as far as the kind of glow that I wanted to have coming from the middle of the miniature, and everything going out gets slowly darker. Once the gradient is finished, I start adding a little bit more white and a little bit more of the same azure color to refine the kind of rough gradient that I had added over the entirety of the miniature. I then also add a little bit of shading onto the other parts of the dress, like her shoulders. And that kind of helps give the figure a little bit more definition as to what's going on as far as the sculpt. The photo that I'm referencing also has a little bit of a design on the corset that we had added. I was thinking of sculpting it in, but I realized there was really no point in doing that. So here I'm just painting in the design as I see it on the photo. Painting the design in the same azure that we've been using throughout this entire paint job, and fixing anything I need to with a little bit of the same white. Then I take a little bit of Vallejo Model Colors purple and add that to the face to create a little bit of contrast, using a slightly different color to make it look a little bit more interesting on her face and to give it a little bit more color as per the art that I'm referencing. But also to make sure it's not too overpowering, I add some watered down blue over top of it, so in the end it ends up being a very subtle detail. And then to finish off the miniature, I go and just add the same gradient to the under part of her dress. And after doing some basing, the miniature is finished. This project was really interesting to work on. I especially enjoyed the painting process, having to approach it from a slightly different perspective, knowing that I wasn't going to be able to use any of the washes that I normally do, since that would dull all the colors and it was supposed to be kind of a glowing, bright character. With that said, I think it turned out very well, especially since I kind of have this default setting of using washes. It's just kind of a magic in a bottle and everything is fine after you just throw a wash on it. So knowing that I couldn't do that was very interesting, and knowing that I normally do that, I'm really happy with how the miniature turned out. A quick little thing I wanted to say before the video ends was that, as you may have noticed in the last video, I have stopped promoting my Patreon because I felt like the Patreon that I had up wasn't what it should be. I wasn't giving enough to the patrons. So because of that, I've decided rather than to keep up a kind of mediocre Patreon, I'm just going to shut it down for the remainder of the time that I'm doing 2 videos a week for the summer where I'm going to be gone, as I mentioned in my channel update a little while ago. So the Patreon is down for now, but it will be coming back up in August sometime, late August, early September, where I can actually devote more time to having the Patreon be worth being a patron for and supporting. So you can look forward to that, and I'm sorry for any confusion that might have happened with that. But anyways, thank you so much for watching that video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell to get notified when I release more videos. Also, if you have any questions or comments, suggestions for future videos, leave them in the comments below.